Hello and welcome to HBR Live. I'm Kurt Nickish, Senior Editor at Harvard Business Review, and I'm here with Moshe Cohen. He teaches leadership and negotiations at Boston University Quest Room School of Business. And I'm really excited because we're going to be talking about a topic today, how to deal with your emotions during a negotiation, how to overcome them, understand them. And it's something that I've actually experienced myself because I find that when I'm negotiating on behalf of my company or on behalf of somebody else or about something that I'm not very emotionally invested in, it often is something that's very easy for me to do, but when I have to negotiate something that I'm really invested in, that's when I notice that I don't negotiate as well, even though I'm supposed to have these same skills across the board. So I want to ask you about that, but I also want to ask for questions because we have an audience joining us from around the world and we want to know what you're thinking. So please subscribe to this so that you can find out about more of these in the future, but please do comment with your questions in the comments so that we can get to as many as we can. So Moshe, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kurt. I think the reason you experience what you're experiencing is because you're normal, you're human. Negotiations actually aren't that hard if you don't care what happens and your emotions don't get engaged in the process. It's when you do care what happens and your emotions get in there. I've seen lots of people who have great skills become completely ineffective. So the question is, what happens to you when negotiations become emotional? And I want to draw you a little picture that might help you understand that.
Sure.
You see, anything that happens to you, anything anybody says to you, anything anybody does, happens first on the emotional level. And emotions hit you very, very hard and very fast. And then they start subsiding. So this is intensity, and this is time. And these are your emotions. Meanwhile, your cognitive brain, your thinking brain, the part that's going to actually figure out how to deal with the issue, is slowly catching up. And only, so these are your thoughts, and only when these two curves cross are you once again a rational thinking human being.
Can you give an example of this?
So sure. So I have friends that were heading off to Mexico on vacation with their kids. And their flights were leaving out of New York, so they were driving from Boston to New York. And then partway through Connecticut, they discovered that their youngest son's passport had expired. Now, what are they feeling at that moment? Well, they're feeling panicked, overwhelmed, maybe anxious. They're afraid they're going to lose all their money. They're not going to have their vacation. The point is that at this point in time, they can't think straight. Because right now, they're in that moment of peak emotion. Now what happens is, from that point on, their emotions subside, and eventually, their thinking process takes over. And what happens then is that they can figure out what to do. This is the region where you can respond to what's going on. All you can do here is react. And you want to be responsive rather than reactive in your negotiations. So this picture actually has a bunch of implications. The first one is that you've got to realize when you're emotionally overwhelmed. Fortunately, our bodies give us some clues that we're emotionally overwhelmed. What does your body do in those moments of high stress? Well, your heart rate goes up, your breathing changes, you start sweating. Sometimes people feel flushed. People sometimes tremble. Every person has different stress symptoms, and you need to know your own. You need to be able to recognize when you're in one of those emotionally overwhelmed states. Now, once you recognize that you're in one of those emotionally overwhelmed states, then your challenge is to slow down time in the negotiation so you can respond rather than react. I'll give you an example. Let's pretend that you're in a negotiation and the other side gives you an offer and says, what do you think? Well, in that moment, you might not know what you think. All you might know is that you are so stressed that you might make a very bad decision. So if you say, yes, I'll accept it, you might regret it. If you say, no, I don't accept it, you might regret it. And the problem is that in that moment, you can't think straight, you don't know what to do. Now, different people have different triggers that send them into emotional overload. A situation that stresses you out, Kurt, may not stress me out at all, and conversely, something that might make me emotionally overwhelmed, you might be fine with. So one of the things that you can do in preparing for your negotiations is to think about what your triggers are. Try to understand the triggers that send you into emotional overload and that make it difficult for you to negotiate. For instance, some people might have a hard time negotiating when they're dealing with authority figures. Other people might have a hard time when emotions get high or people get upset or raise their voice. Somebody else might have a hard time with conflict. You need to know your signals, and based on your triggers, you need to know to anticipate that you're going to be in emotional overload. Because if you can anticipate when you're going to be in emotional overload, then you can prepare for that and decrease the chances that these emotional peaks are going to be as high. Now, once you're there, once you've realized that you're in an emotionally bad place, well, then you need to bring yourself down on this curve. And the question is, how can you slow down time in a negotiation? How can you manage your emotions in real time so you can respond rather than react? And there's some things you can do. One thing that you can do to manage your emotions and slow down time is take a break. Find some way of disengaging from the negotiation. There was one negotiation I was involved with once where the other party was purely insulting. It was just a miserable experience. Not only were they tough negotiators, but they were absolutely abusive during the negotiation process. Every time I talked to them, and this negotiation was conducted on the phone, within 5-10 minutes I was so upset that I was sure that I was going to say something I regretted. Well, what I would do then is I would tell them the words of the effective negotiator. Ready? I would tell them, thank you, let me get back to you. And by disengaging from the negotiation, I was able to take a break and come back strategic. Now, it took me 3 or 4 days in those instances to come back strategic because I was so upset.
Moshe, I want to interrupt you for a second because we're hearing that there's some static in your microphone. Do you want to switch microphones with me?
Oh, I would love to switch microphones.
Let's try it, and we'll see if you sound better. Sorry for the noise, folks.
Maybe I just have a staticky voice.
Probably not. Put that up nice and high.
Okay. I don't know if this sounds any better.
Go for it.
Excellent. So in that instance that I described, it was a very lengthy negotiation. I was able to stretch that negotiation over a period of several weeks, each time disengaging and giving myself 3 or 4 days to get back on even keel before I re-engaged in the negotiation. Now, in most situations, you don't have that kind of time. You don't have the 3 or 4 days, but you can still take very short breaks. You can take a, I need to make a phone call break. You can take, I need to do some calculations break. You can take an, I need to check in with someone or use the facilities break. Manufacture some reason why you can disengage from this negotiation, and even a few seconds of time of disengaging should allow you to come back, at least if not all the way down on the curve, partly down on the curve so you're in better shape. Sometimes you can't disengage at all. Sometimes the situation is such that you have to stay in the room and you still need to slow down time because you don't want to make any concessions, commitments, or do anything of significance when you're up at this peak point. So the question is, how can you slow down time without ever leaving the room? One thing you can do to slow down time is to say nothing. Silence is an enormously powerful tool when you're negotiating. Not only is silence powerful, but in addition to that, if you're not saying anything at all, you're also not going to say anything that you're going to regret. There are many negotiations that I've had where things have gone awry. In almost all of them, I said something here that I would have been better off thinking but not saying. Other people do other things. Some people can manage their breathing to get themselves back on even keel. I take notes when I negotiate because one of the things that happens when I take notes is I can't write as fast as I talk. And that slows me down, and that gives me a place to recenter myself if something knocks me off kilter.
Which I want to ask a question here. Can you give an example of just sort of when somebody says something in that situation, how you react, and just give me more of a sense of the negotiations that you're feeling there and why you have to slow that down. We did get a question too which plays into this whole emotional response curve that you're drawing here. It's from Paul. And he's asking, what about scientific evidence that we unconsciously decide up to 6 seconds before we consciously believe that we think we're deciding something? I don't know if you've heard of that you may have already made decisions before you actually consciously make a decision.
So I got to say, honestly, I'm not familiar with that, but I think it's very consistent with this. What you're saying is that your subconscious brain operates actually faster than you become conscious of what's going on. That's even more reinforcement for the idea of slowing yourself down before you do or say anything of significance. Because if your subconscious brain decided something up here, giving yourself some time before you actually articulate anything or do anything of significance will allow your conscious brain to catch up to that. So although I'm not familiar with that, I think it's very consistent with the same idea of slowing yourself down in your negotiations to let all parts of your brain sort of catch up to each other.
So what are some tricks you can use to do that?
One of my favorite tricks to do that is when you encounter a situation where you don't know how to respond and you're emotionally overwhelmed, instead of responding to the person, acknowledge what they've said and then turn around and ask them questions so you shift the focus to them. And while they're answering your questions, you don't have to say anything of your own. And that buys you the time you need to try to figure out what's going on. So I'll give you a concrete example.
Sure.
Okay? Let's pretend that you're negotiating and the person that you're negotiating with says, how much of a discount are you going to give me? All right, now in that moment of feeling overwhelmed, you might not want to answer the question because if you offer a discount, you might be offering more than you need to. If you don't offer a discount, you might be turning them off. And you're frozen and you don't know how to respond in that situation. So one of the things that you can do is turn to them and say, so it sounds like you're looking for a reduction in price. Tell me more about what's going on your end that you're looking for that. All right, and you shift the focus to them. And at that point, you stop answering questions and you become the one who's asking the questions. And if you are artful at asking questions and listening, you can keep them on the side of being the ones who are answering the questions long enough, not only for you to learn some valuable information as to how to respond to that, but also long enough for you to calm down. And then when you finally do respond, you can do it from a much more centered place.
And you may also have a better understanding of the justification or the emotional reasons in the person that you're negotiating with, why they're actually asking for these things.
Right. You actually have some understanding of their interests, which will then help you frame your answer to them.
Because if you were at first angry that they're asking for something and then you understand it, you're actually dealing with